6 months away had been long enough to dull excitement into something quieter, more cautious, but as Daniel Carter returned to Chicago, that restraint gave way to a feeling he had not allowed himself in years: certainty. For most of his adult life, certainty had been missing. It had been replaced by medical reports, second opinions, silent drives home after appointments, and the unspoken understanding that some dreams might never arrive. He and his wife, Olivia Carter, had spent years navigating infertility, trying every option available within reason, and then beyond it. The conclusion had been clear, clinical, and devastating. The chances of having a child were almost non-existent. That was the life Daniel had left behind half a year earlier when business obligations forced him overseas. At the time, leaving had felt like a pause in a story that had already reached its ending. But everything had changed during his absence. Olivia had conceived. The pregnancy had progressed. And now, earlier than expected, she had given birth to a baby girl. By the time Daniel stepped back into the United States, the news had already settled into reality for everyone except him. His mother, Margaret Carter, had been at Olivia's side throughout the pregnancy, ensuring every appointment was attended, every instruction followed. Margaret, who had built a successful chain of pharmacies across the city, had approached the situation with the same precision and control that defined her career. There had been no room for uncertainty in her version of events. The hospital chosen for the delivery was one of the most exclusive private facilities in Chicago, known for discretion and comfort. Olivia had been admitted there weeks earlier for observation due to complications tied to the premature timing. By the time Daniel arrived, the birth had already taken place. The moment he had imagined for years, the moment he thought he might never experience, had happened without him. Still, none of that mattered once he entered the room. The reality in front of him seemed to erase everything that had come before. Olivia was resting, her expression carrying the quiet exhaustion that followed something irreversible and life-altering. Margaret moved with controlled efficiency, managing details, organizing belongings, ensuring everything aligned with her expectations. And at the center of it all was the child, Ava Carter. The name had been chosen without him, but it felt right immediately. It carried a simplicity that matched the clarity of the moment. For Daniel, that clarity was overwhelming. After years defined by absence, there was now presence. After years of waiting, there was now completion. The explanations provided to him were straightforward. The baby had arrived a month early. The delivery had been managed quickly due to timing. There had been no opportunity to delay or notify him in a way that would have changed anything. From a practical standpoint, everything made sense. From an emotional standpoint, it felt like catching up to a life that had moved forward without him. Olivia mentioned that breastfeeding had not yet been possible, attributing it to complications related to the early delivery. The hospital had provided donor milk to ensure the baby's needs were met. Margaret reinforced that the situation was temporary and medically managed. Daniel accepted the explanation without hesitation. After everything they had endured, small irregularities seemed insignificant compared to the outcome. What mattered was that the child was here. What mattered was that Olivia was safe. What mattered was that the long period of uncertainty had ended. Sarah Carter, Daniel's younger sister and a nurse at the same hospital, entered briefly during that first visit. Her presence added a layer of familiarity to an otherwise overwhelming environment. She had been involved in Olivia's care throughout the pregnancy, offering both professional and personal support. Her reaction to Daniel's arrival was warm, but there was a tension beneath it that he did not immediately register. At the time, it blended into the general intensity of the moment. Everything about the situation carried a sense of urgency that had already passed. Decisions had been made. Events had unfolded. Daniel had arrived at the conclusion rather than the process. But the conclusion, as it appeared to him, was everything he had once hoped for. The hospital discharge process began quickly. Paperwork, instructions, prescriptions, all handled with efficiency. Margaret ensured that no detail was overlooked. Olivia expressed a desire to return home as soon as possible, to begin what she described as their real life as a family. Daniel agreed without hesitation. The idea of bringing the child into their home felt like the natural next step, the final piece that would solidify everything. There was no hesitation in his mind, no suspicion, no reason to question the narrative that had been presented to him. Every element fit within the boundaries of what he understood, even if some parts had occurred beyond his direct experience. For Daniel, the story was simple. A difficult journey had finally reached its resolution. The absence of a child had defined his life for too long. Now, that absence had been replaced with something tangible, something undeniable. As he prepared to leave the hospital with Olivia, Margaret, and Ava, Daniel believed he was stepping into a future that had once seemed impossible. The uncertainty that had shaped his past no longer held relevance. What remained was a sense of completion, a belief that everything had aligned at last. At that moment, there was no indication that the reality he was accepting so fully was built on something fragile. No sign that the clarity he felt would soon be replaced by doubt. No reason to think that the life he believed he had just begun was already connected to something far more complicated than he could see. For now, everything appeared exactly as it should. The process of leaving the hospital unfolded with a quiet efficiency that should have felt reassuring. For Daniel, it marked the transition from something temporary to something permanent, from a contained environment to the beginning of a new routine. The paperwork was completed, the instructions were given, and the formalities of discharge were handled without complication. On the surface, everything aligned with what he expected from a well-run private facility. Yet within that order, there were interruptions, small disruptions that did not belong. Sarah remained close during the final steps, guiding the administrative process, ensuring the necessary documents were prepared. Her role gave her authority within the system, but her demeanor carried a tension that did not match her words. She moved through each requirement as if anticipating something, or avoiding it. Daniel noticed it in passing but attributed it to fatigue. The past days had been intense for everyone involved. Olivia's responses during this time were measured. She confirmed information when necessary, acknowledged instructions, and maintained a composed presence. But there was a pattern emerging in her behavior, an unwillingness to linger on details, especially those related to medical explanations. When questions arose about feeding, recovery, or follow-up care, her answers were brief and redirected. Margaret often stepped in to reinforce them, framing everything within a controlled, simplified narrative. Daniel accepted these dynamics without resistance. It was not unusual for Margaret to take charge, nor for Olivia to rely on her. Given the circumstances, it seemed reasonable. What did not seem reasonable, though Daniel did not yet define it that way, was what happened near the end of their departure. The disturbance began somewhere along the corridor leading toward the exit. It was not loud at first, more like an interruption that struggled to break through the controlled environment of the hospital. A voice, strained and uneven, carried through the space. It did not belong to staff or visitors moving with purpose. It carried urgency without direction. As Daniel became aware of it, the voice sharpened into something more distinct. Words began to take shape, fragmented, repetitive, centered around a single idea. A claim, a loss, a demand that seemed disconnected from everything around it. A woman emerged into view, her presence immediately drawing attention. Her appearance did not align with the environment. Her condition suggested instability, but her focus was precise. She moved with a determination that bypassed hesitation, as though she had identified something that mattered more than anything else. Her attention fixed on Daniel and his family. For a moment, the connection did not register. Then it did. The woman's gaze remained locked in their direction. The words she repeated became clearer, centered on a child, on something taken, on something that belonged to her. There was no ambiguity in her intention, even if the context was unclear. Her presence disrupted the controlled rhythm of the hospital in a way that demanded resolution. Sarah responded immediately. She positioned herself between the woman and Daniel's family, creating a barrier both physical and procedural. Her explanation came quickly, framed in terms that minimized the situation. The woman was described as someone without stable housing, someone who had found her way into the facility and was now being removed. Sarah's tone carried authority, reassurance, and dismissal all at once. Hospital staff moved to intervene. Security followed shortly after. The woman's voice continued, but it was gradually redirected, contained, and moved away from the immediate area. The process was efficient, almost practiced, as though such incidents were not entirely uncommon. Margaret reinforced the explanation. She framed the situation as an unfortunate but routine issue in a city like Chicago, where access to public spaces sometimes overlapped with private institutions. Her interpretation carried a tone of certainty that left little room for further consideration. Olivia supported that perspective. Her focus shifted immediately toward leaving, toward completing the transition out of the hospital. She expressed a need to get home, to establish stability for the baby, to move forward without delay. Her urgency aligned with a desire for normalcy, for control over what came next. Daniel paused, not physically in a way that disrupted the process, but internally. The woman's presence had introduced a variable that did not fit into the narrative he had accepted. Her reaction had not seemed random. It had not seemed like confusion. It had carried intention. But intention alone did not equal truth. The explanation provided by Sarah and reinforced by Margaret offered a complete framework. It accounted for the situation, placed it within a familiar social context, and removed any direct connection to Daniel's family. It allowed the moment to be dismissed without further investigation. Daniel chose to accept that framework. The decision was not based on certainty but on alignment. Everything else in his experience supported the version of reality he had been given. The birth, the medical care, the presence of his family, all of it pointed toward a legitimate, if accelerated, process. One disruption, no matter how intense, did not outweigh the consistency of everything else. As they continued toward the exit, the incident was already being absorbed into the background of the day. Still, it did not disappear completely. There was something about the woman's focus that lingered. Not in a way that demanded immediate action, but in a way that resisted full dismissal. It remained unresolved, unverified, and unexplained beyond the surface-level interpretation. Daniel carried that unresolved detail with him as they left the hospital. The transition from the controlled environment of the facility to the outside world marked the end of one phase and the beginning of another. The expectation was simple: to move forward, to establish a routine, to build the life that had finally become possible. The disturbance had been contained. The explanation had been provided. The moment had passed. And yet, without fully understanding why, Daniel recognized that something had shifted. Not enough to disrupt his belief, but enough to leave a trace. The drive away from the hospital should have created a sense of closure, a clean separation between what had just happened and what would follow. For Daniel, it did not work that way. The earlier disruption did not disappear once it was out of sight. It remained present in a quieter form, not demanding attention but refusing to be fully dismissed. He redirected his focus toward something practical. The need to establish normal routine felt more urgent than revisiting an incident that had already been explained. Olivia's condition, the baby's needs, and the expectation of settling into a new phase of life took priority. That priority gave structure to his thinking and helped him move forward. The first interruption came from something simple and unavoidable: the realization that Olivia's discharge medication had not been collected. It was not a major issue in itself, but it represented a gap in the otherwise controlled process Margaret had been managing. The decision to return to the hospital was immediate. There was no debate about it. Olivia's recovery remained essential, and skipping necessary treatment was not an option. The return introduced Daniel to the same environment under different circumstances. The earlier sense of completion was gone. In its place was a need to resolve something incomplete. This shift in context changed how he perceived what he encountered. Near the entrance, the same woman from before appeared again, no longer isolated from attention. This time, she was engaged directly with law enforcement. Her behavior had changed. The intensity was still present, but it was now focused into something more structured. She was not being dismissed as easily as before. Her claims were being recorded. Daniel recognized her immediately. The recognition was immediate, not because of her appearance, but because of the clarity of her focus. When her attention turned toward him again, the connection felt more deliberate than before. It was no longer a passing moment. It was repeated. That repetition created tension. The explanation he had accepted earlier did not account for persistence. If the situation had been as simple as Sarah had described, it should have ended with removal. It should not have escalated into police involvement. It should not have returned in this form. The gap between explanation and reality widened slightly. Daniel did not engage. He continued with his original purpose, entering the hospital to collect the medication. The decision to avoid involvement was conscious. It aligned with the expectation that professionals were already handling the situation. It also aligned with his desire to maintain focus on his family. Inside, the hospital operated with the same structured efficiency as before. The pharmacy process, however, introduced delay. The system required time to process prescriptions, verify records, and prepare medication. The estimated wait extended beyond what Daniel had anticipated. With time to wait, the environment became more noticeable. Fragments of conversation surfaced, not directed at him, but audible enough to register. References to an unusual case, to confusion surrounding a patient, to administrative complications that did not fit standard procedures. None of the conversations were complete. None provided a full narrative. But together they suggested something irregular. Daniel did not yet interpret these fragments as evidence. He treated them as background noise, the kind that often exists in large institutions. Hospitals, like any complex system, generate inconsistencies. Not all of them are significant. Still, the earlier encounter with the woman altered how those inconsistencies felt. They no longer existed in isolation. While waiting, Daniel's thoughts returned to the sequence of events that had led to this moment. The timeline of Olivia's pregnancy, the speed of the delivery, the lack of direct communication during critical stages, all of it had been explained, but none of it had been experienced by him firsthand. His understanding was based entirely on what he had been told. That realization did not immediately lead to doubt, but it introduced a distinction between knowledge and belief. When the medication was finally prepared, Daniel completed the process quickly. The task that had brought him back was resolved. The expectation was that this would close the loop, allowing everything to move forward without interruption. As he exited the hospital, the police presence was no longer visible. The woman was gone. The absence created its own kind of uncertainty. If the situation had escalated to the point of police involvement, its resolution should have been visible in some form. Instead, it had disappeared without explanation. The pattern repeated itself. Disruption, containment, removal, each time leaving less information than it introduced. Daniel returned to the car with the medication in hand. The immediate responsibility had been fulfilled. Olivia's treatment could continue without delay. From a practical standpoint, everything was back on track. Yet internally, the sense of alignment had shifted. The earlier framework that allowed him to dismiss the woman's claims no longer fit as cleanly. It still existed, but it required more effort to maintain. Each new inconsistency added weight to the part of his mind that resisted simple explanations. He did not voice these thoughts. There was no clear reason to do so, no concrete evidence, no direct contradiction of what he had been told. What existed was a pattern of small irregularities that, on their own, did not demand action. Together, however, they began to form something more difficult to ignore. As they continued toward home, Daniel focused again on what lay ahead. The responsibility of being a father, the need to support Olivia, the expectation of stability, all of it required his attention. The path forward depended on his ability to commit to the reality in front of him. But for the first time since arriving in Chicago, that reality did not feel completely fixed. It felt conditional, not yet broken, but no longer unquestioned. Returning home should have marked the point where everything settled into place. For Daniel, that expectation was immediate and practical. The hospital had been a temporary environment governed by procedures and unfamiliar routines. Home was supposed to restore clarity, giving structure to the next phase of life. Instead, the transition introduced a different kind of uncertainty, one that was harder to define because it existed within familiarity. The house operated with a rhythm that did not include him. From the moment they arrived, Margaret and Olivia assumed full control of every decision related to the baby. The structure they followed appeared deliberate, consistent, and closed. Feeding schedules, rest periods, medical considerations, everything was handled with precision, but none of it required Daniel's involvement. His presence was acknowledged but not integrated. It was not rejection, not openly, but it was exclusion in practice. At first, Daniel interpreted this as a matter of adjustment. Olivia had gone through the delivery without him. Margaret had been the constant support throughout the pregnancy. Their coordination was the result of shared experience he had not been part of. It made sense that they would continue operating in a way that reflected that history. But as time passed, the pattern did not shift. Attempts to participate were redirected. Questions were answered without depth. Explanations existed, but they remained surface level, always sufficient to close a conversation but never detailed enough to invite understanding. Olivia often deferred to Margaret when specifics were involved, and Margaret's responses consistently framed everything as under control. One detail in particular began to stand out. The medication Daniel had retrieved from the hospital remained unused. It had been presented as necessary for Olivia's recovery, especially given the complications associated with the early delivery. The instructions had been clear, yet the medication stayed untouched, positioned as though it were part of the environment rather than part of a treatment plan. When Daniel noticed it, he initially assumed timing was the reason. Perhaps it had already been taken earlier. Perhaps there was a schedule he had not yet learned. But as the hours passed, that assumption became harder to maintain. Olivia had expressed concern about her recovery and about her inability to breastfeed. The medication was directly connected to those concerns. Ignoring it contradicted her earlier statements. When Daniel raised the issue, the response came quickly but without substance. Olivia acknowledged the medication, indicated that she would take it, and moved on without further explanation. Margaret reinforced the response, minimizing the importance of strict adherence and suggesting that adjustments were normal. The explanation sounded reasonable, but it did not align with the urgency that had been expressed before. This inconsistency did not stand alone. Other details followed a similar pattern. The feeding process for the baby did not evolve as expected. The reliance on formula continued without clear transition. Medical follow-ups were mentioned but not scheduled in a way Daniel could verify. Each individual detail remained explainable, but together they created a structure that felt incomplete. Daniel began to observe more carefully, not out of suspicion in the beginning, but out of a need to understand the system he was now part of. Parenthood required awareness. It required engagement, yet the structure around him limited both. Information flowed in one direction, from Olivia and Margaret to him, and it rarely expanded beyond what was necessary. That limitation changed how Daniel processed what he was seeing. The earlier events at the hospital resurfaced in his thinking. The woman who had claimed a child, the police involvement, the fragments of conversation he had overheard, those moments had not resolved themselves. They had simply been set aside. Now, within the controlled environment of his own home, they began to connect with the inconsistencies in front of him. The connection was not yet logical. It was intuitive. Daniel did not form conclusions. He formed questions. Why had the medication not been used? Why did Olivia avoid extended discussion about her recovery? Why did Margaret maintain such tight control over information? Why did every attempt at deeper understanding result in redirection? These questions did not have immediate answers. What they had was persistence. At the same time, Daniel's awareness extended to the baby herself. Ava represented the center of everything, the reason for every decision, the justification for every action. Observing her became unavoidable. In doing so, Daniel began to notice details he had not focused on before. Physical traits, small distinctions, features that, when viewed individually, meant nothing but when considered collectively introduced doubt. Daniel did not approach this from an emotional perspective. He approached it analytically, Genetics followed patterns. Similarities between parents and children were not always immediate, but they existed. In Ava, those similarities were not clearly present. The absence did not prove anything, but it added weight to the growing sense that something was misaligned. Daniel resisted the impulse to act on that feeling. Without evidence, action would only create conflict. And conflict, at this stage, would destabilize everything without providing clarity. Instead, he continued observing, allowing the pattern to develop further. The dynamic within the house remained unchanged. Margaret maintained control. Olivia followed a structured role within that control. Daniel existed on the edge of both, included in identity but excluded in function. The longer this dynamic continued, the more difficult it became to reconcile with the idea of a shared family. What had initially felt like completion now felt conditional. The narrative Daniel had accepted, of a long-awaited child finally arriving, remained intact on the surface. But beneath that surface, inconsistencies were accumulating, forming a structure that did not align with the story he had been given. By the end of the day, Daniel understood one thing clearly. He was no longer operating within certainty. He was operating within a system that required verification. And that shift, once recognized, could not be undone. The next morning did not bring clarity. It brought routine, but the routine felt constructed rather than natural. Daniel woke with the same unresolved questions from the night before, and instead of fading, they had settled into something more structured. They no longer felt like passing doubts. They felt like variables waiting to be tested. The house functioned as it had the day before. Olivia and Margaret moved through their established system without deviation. The baby's care followed a schedule Daniel could observe but not influence. His role remained undefined. He was present, acknowledged, but not integrated into the decisions that mattered. The separation was subtle enough to avoid confrontation, yet consistent enough to reinforce itself. Daniel did not challenge it. Not yet. A call from his business partner interrupted the morning. It introduced a separate urgency, one that demanded his attention regardless of what was happening at home. A shipment of pharmaceutical products had been flagged at customs due to labeling discrepancies. The issue had potential regulatory consequences, and his presence at the office was required to manage the response. The timing was inconvenient, but the responsibility was unavoidable. Daniel agreed to go. Before leaving, he noted again that the medication remained unused. The observation carried more weight than before. It was no longer a detail he could dismiss. It was part of a pattern. He mentioned it once more, briefly, and received the same type of response. Acknowledgement without action, reassurance without substance. He left without pressing further. The drive into the city provided distance, but not resolution. If anything, it created space for his thoughts to organize. Without the immediate presence of Olivia and Margaret, the inconsistencies became easier to isolate. Each one, on its own, remained explainable. Together, they formed something that resisted explanation. At the office, the environment demanded focus. Meetings were already in progress. Legal advisors, operations managers, and compliance specialists were engaged in evaluating the situation. Daniel stepped into that structure and responded as expected. He reviewed documents, considered options, and authorized actions designed to contain the problem. But his attention was divided. The issue at work required analytical thinking. The situation at home required something else. It required interpretation, a process that could not be completed through data alone. Daniel attempted to maintain separation between the two, but the effort was incomplete. His focus shifted, not abruptly, but repeatedly. During a break, he stepped away from the conference room and entered the lounge area. The purpose was simple: to reset, to create a moment of distance from the immediate pressure of decision-making. On a nearby counter, a stack of local newspapers had been left for employees. Daniel picked one up without intention, scanning headlines without expectation. Then he stopped. A photograph on one of the pages captured his attention. It was not immediately clear why. The image showed a newborn, wrapped in a pink blanket, wearing a small floral headband. The composition was ordinary, but the detail was not. The baby in the photograph carried a feature Daniel recognized. A small, distinct birthmark positioned near the left temple. The recognition was immediate and precise. It bypassed uncertainty. It connected directly to his memory of Ava. The similarity was not general. It was specific. Daniel shifted from scanning to reading. The headline identified the situation. A missing newborn. The article described a woman named Rachel Monroe, a homeless individual who had reported her baby missing shortly after being discharged from the same hospital where Olivia had given birth. The timeline aligned. The location aligned. The details aligned. Each sentence added confirmation rather than confusion. Rachel had entered the hospital in labor. The delivery had taken place under circumstances that were not fully documented. After the birth, the baby had disappeared. The hospital had initiated an internal review. Law enforcement had been notified. The case had been made public due to the lack of immediate resolution. Daniel did not need to read further to understand the implications. The earlier encounters returned with clarity. The woman in the hospital, the repeated claims, the police involvement, the fragments of conversation, the behavior at home, the unused medication, the controlled narrative, the lack of transparency. What had been separate details became a unified structure. Daniel retrieved his phone and accessed the photograph he had taken of Ava at the hospital. The comparison required no interpretation. The blanket matched. The headband matched. The birthmark matched. The probability of coincidence was effectively eliminated. The conclusion formed without resistance. The child in his home was not his daughter. The realization did not arrive as a gradual understanding. It arrived as a completed thought. Everything that had seemed misaligned now fit within a different framework. The narrative he had accepted was replaced by one that accounted for all inconsistencies. Daniel did not react immediately. The implications required processing, not emotion. The situation extended beyond personal impact. It involved legal, ethical, and human consequences that could not be addressed impulsively. He considered the options available to him. Ignoring the situation was possible in theory. Maintaining the existing structure would preserve the life he had been given, even if it was based on deception. The cost of that choice, however, extended beyond himself. It affected the woman identified in the article. It affected the child. It affected the integrity of everything involved. The alternative was to act. Acting would initiate a process that could not be controlled once started. It would expose the truth regardless of the outcome. It would dismantle the structure that had been built. It would carry consequences for Olivia, for Margaret, and for anyone else involved. Daniel understood that both options carried weight, but only one aligned with reality. He opened the dial screen on his phone. The decision, once made, did not waver. He contacted emergency services and reported a suspected kidnapping. The information he provided was direct and specific. He identified the individuals involved, the location, and the basis for his conclusion. The response from the operator followed protocol, confirming details and initiating a process that would extend beyond his control. When the call ended, the situation had changed permanently. Daniel remained in place, the noise of the office continuing around him without interruption. The problem he had been addressing minutes earlier no longer held the same significance. The focus of his life had shifted entirely. The truth had replaced assumption, and once acknowledged, it could not be undone. After the call, Daniel no longer had the option of uncertainty. The process he had initiated moved forward with a momentum that did not depend on his control. What had existed as suspicion was now an active investigation. The truth would not be shaped by interpretation anymore. It would be reconstructed through facts. Before law enforcement reached the house, Daniel made one more decision. He contacted Marcus Reed, the family's driver. Marcus had been present during most of Daniel's absence. If anything unusual had occurred, Marcus would have seen it, even if he had not understood it at the time. Marcus did not respond immediately. When he did, the hesitation was noticeable. It was not resistance in the sense of refusal, but it carried weight. Daniel did not present the situation as a question. He presented it as a reality already in motion. The mention of police involvement removed any space for avoidance. The response that followed confirmed what Daniel had begun to understand. Marcus acknowledged that during the past several months, he had been instructed to drive Olivia and Margaret to locations that did not fit their usual routine. These were not medical offices or standard appointments. They were specific, repeated visits to a woman who did not belong to their social or professional circles. The meetings had been private, conducted without explanation, and always framed as something that did not require discussion. At the time, Marcus had not questioned it. His role was to drive, not to interpret, but the pattern had stood out. On the morning of the delivery, the situation had escalated. Marcus had been directed to pick up the same woman, who was in labor. Instead of taking her through the main hospital entrance, he had been instructed to use a side access point. There, Sarah had been waiting, along with a physician Daniel did not recognize by name at the time. The process that followed had been quick, controlled, and isolated from standard procedures. Marcus had not been present inside the room, but he had seen enough to understand that what was happening did not align with normal protocol. Still, he had remained silent. Margaret had made it clear that discretion was expected. His employment depended on compliance, and he had chosen not to risk it. Daniel did not interrupt the account. Each detail added structure to what he already knew. The information did not surprise him anymore. It confirmed the pattern that had already formed. The involvement of Sarah and a doctor extended the scope of the situation. This was not a single decision. It was a coordinated effort. It required planning, access, and the willingness of multiple individuals to act outside legal and ethical boundaries. Marcus's final statement clarified one more critical point. Olivia had appeared pregnant during Daniel's absence, but the progression had not been consistent. The physical indicators had been present, but the timeline had not followed a predictable pattern. At the time, Marcus had attributed it to his own lack of understanding. Now, in retrospect, it aligned with a constructed narrative rather than a biological process. When the call ended, Daniel had everything he needed to understand the structure of the deception. Law enforcement arrived at the house shortly after. The process that followed moved with efficiency. Officers entered with a clear objective, supported by the information Daniel had provided and the ongoing investigation connected to Rachel Monroe's report. There was no delay, no ambiguity about why they were there. Rachel was present. Her presence changed the dynamic immediately. The earlier encounters at the hospital had established her claim, but now that claim was supported by evidence and context. She was no longer an isolated figure making an accusation. She was part of a formal process. The baby was identified. The recognition was immediate for Rachel. It did not require confirmation from anyone else. The connection was direct, emotional, and undeniable. For the officers, however, the process required verification. Identification, documentation, and adherence to procedure took priority over interpretation. Olivia's response shifted from controlled composure to direct resistance. The narrative she had maintained until that point was no longer sustainable, but she did not abandon it immediately. Instead, she attempted to reinforce it, asserting ownership of the child and rejecting the claims presented against her. Margaret followed a different approach. Her response was structured, focused on justification rather than denial. She framed the situation as a solution to a problem, emphasizing the years of infertility, the emotional impact on Daniel, and the intention behind the decisions that had been made. The explanation did not deny the actions. It attempted to rationalize them. The officers did not engage with justification. Their role was not to evaluate intention. It was to enforce the law. As the process continued, the structure of the plan became clear through statements and evidence. Rachel had been approached early in her pregnancy. The offer presented to her had been framed as a form of surrogacy, but without the legal framework or protections that legitimate arrangements require. Financial compensation had been used as leverage, targeting her immediate needs and limited options. Over time, Rachel had developed a connection to the child that conflicted with the agreement she had been led to believe she had made. By the time of the delivery, her position had changed. She no longer wanted to give up the baby. But by then, the structure of the plan had already been set in motion. The delivery itself had been managed outside standard oversight. Medical records had been altered. Documentation had been created to support a narrative that did not reflect reality. The baby had been transferred immediately, and Rachel had been discharged with minimal follow-up and an expectation of silence. Her decision to report the incident had disrupted the entire structure. As each element was confirmed, the situation moved from uncertainty to resolution. The baby was no longer part of a disputed claim. The baby was evidence. The officers proceeded with the necessary actions. Olivia and Margaret were taken into custody. The charges were outlined in general terms, with specifics to follow through the legal process. Their control over the situation ended at that moment. Sarah's involvement was addressed separately. Her role as a medical professional had enabled access that would not have been possible otherwise. The physician involved faced similar consequences. Their actions had transformed a personal decision into a systemic violation. Daniel did not intervene. The process was no longer his to control. His role had shifted from participant to witness. The decisions made by others had created the situation. His decision had exposed it. As the house transitioned from a private space to an active investigation, the structure that had defined his understanding of his life dissolved completely. What remained was not resolution. It was the beginning of accountability. The investigation did not pause once the initial arrests were made. It expanded, formalized, and began to define consequences in concrete terms. What had started as a personal discovery now moved into a legal framework that no longer depended on individual explanations. Statements were taken, timelines were reconstructed, and each person involved was required to account for their role within the structure that had been exposed. Rachel Monroe provided a full account. Her version of events did not rely on interpretation. It relied on sequence. She described how Margaret had first approached her during the early stage of pregnancy, presenting an offer framed as assistance. The language used at the time suggested legitimacy, referencing surrogacy and financial support. But there had been no legal contract, no independent counsel, and no safeguards. The agreement had existed only in conversation, shaped by imbalance rather than clarity. Rachel explained that her initial decision had been driven by immediate need. Financial pressure, unresolved debt, and lack of stability had limited her options. The offer presented to her appeared to solve multiple problems at once. But as the pregnancy progressed, the emotional reality shifted. What had begun as an arrangement became a connection she could not detach from. By the time she attempted to reconsider, the structure around her had already closed. Her account of the delivery aligned with what Daniel had already learned. She had been transported through a secondary entrance. The presence of Sarah and the physician had been immediate. The process had been managed with efficiency, but without transparency. After the birth, she had not been given the opportunity to remain with the child. The discharge had been expedited, the communication limited, and the expectation of silence reinforced through financial compensation. Her decision to report the situation had not been immediate. It had followed a period of confusion and uncertainty. Once she understood that the arrangement had no legal standing and that the child had been taken without enforceable consent, she had sought help. The report initiated the investigation that ultimately intersected with Daniel's discovery. As Rachel's statement was recorded, the legal implications for the others became clearer. Olivia's position shifted as the process continued. Initially, she had attempted to maintain the narrative that the child was hers, but that position became unsustainable under examination. The documentation did not support her claim. The timeline did not align with a biological pregnancy. The involvement of third parties introduced contradictions that could not be resolved through assertion alone. Her explanation, when it emerged, focused on intent. She described years of infertility, the emotional impact of repeated failure, and the pressure to fulfill expectations within her marriage and family. The decision to proceed with the arrangement was framed as a last resort, a solution that seemed justified at the time. But the explanation did not address the legality of the actions taken. It did not change the fact that the child had been removed from Rachel without lawful process. Margaret's role was more direct. Her involvement had been central from the beginning. She had identified Rachel, initiated the arrangement, and coordinated the logistics required to execute it. Her justification relied on the same foundation as Olivia's, but with greater emphasis on control. She described the situation as a problem that required resolution, one she believed she had the capacity to manage. The legal framework did not recognize that justification. The charges outlined against both Olivia and Margaret reflected the severity of their actions. Fraud, conspiracy, and violations related to identity and custody formed the basis of the case. The specifics would be determined through court proceedings, but the direction was already established. Sarah and the physician faced separate consequences. Their cooperation during the investigation influenced the approach taken by prosecutors, but it did not eliminate responsibility. The alteration of medical records, the facilitation of an unregulated delivery, and the concealment of information constituted serious violations of professional standards. The outcome included the loss of their licenses and the possibility of criminal penalties. Daniel's position within the process remained distinct. He was not implicated in the actions that had taken place, but his connection to those responsible required formal clarification. His statement confirmed his absence during the relevant period and his lack of knowledge regarding the arrangement. The timeline supported his account. His role in reporting the situation further established his separation from the decisions that had been made. Despite that separation, the personal impact remained significant. The structure of his family had not simply changed. It had been dismantled. The relationships he had relied on, his marriage, his trust in his mother, his confidence in his sister, had all been built on information that was no longer valid. What had seemed stable now existed only as a sequence of actions that led to the present situation. Daniel did not attempt to reconstruct that structure. There was no clear path to doing so. The actions taken by Olivia and Margaret were not isolated mistakes. They were deliberate decisions carried out over time, involving multiple participants and requiring sustained concealment. The level of planning involved removed the possibility of misunderstanding. As the investigation moved forward, the focus shifted toward resolution. Rachel regained custody of her child through the appropriate legal process. The transition was managed under supervision, ensuring that all procedures were followed correctly. For the first time since the birth, the child was placed within the framework that recognized her as belonging to Rachel. Daniel observed this outcome without attempting to influence it. The decision he had made to report what he had discovered had led directly to this point. The consequences for others were still unfolding, but the immediate objective had been achieved. The child had been returned to her mother. The truth had been established. The cost of that outcome extended beyond legal consequences. It defined a permanent change in Daniel's life. What remained was not a continuation of what had been lost. It was the absence of it. The legal process continued beyond what Daniel could fully follow in real time. Court dates were scheduled, charges were formalized, and each participant moved into a system that would determine outcomes over months, possibly years. What had once been contained within a private decision now existed as a matter of public record. The situation no longer belonged to any single individual. It had entered a structure where accountability would be measured, documented, and enforced. Daniel's involvement shifted again. His statement had been given. His role in initiating the investigation was clear. From a legal standpoint, his position was stable. From a personal standpoint, nothing about his life resembled stability. The house that had represented success and continuity no longer carried the same meaning. It held the remnants of a narrative that had been proven false. Every assumption attached to it had been stripped away. Daniel did not attempt to reclaim it as it was. He understood that what had been lost could not be restored through denial or reconstruction. Rachel Monroe faced a different set of challenges. Regaining custody of her child had resolved the most immediate injustice, but it had not eliminated the conditions that had made her vulnerable in the first place. Financial instability, lack of housing, and limited access to resources remained part of her reality. The legal system had returned her child. It had not yet provided a sustainable path forward. Daniel chose to remain involved. The decision did not come from obligation. It came from recognition. The situation existed in part because of the resources and influence connected to his family. While he had not participated in the deception, he had benefited from the structure that made it possible. That understanding shaped his next steps. He arranged for Rachel and her child to stay temporarily in his home. The decision required adjustments, both practical and psychological. The environment had to be redefined, not as a continuation of what had existed before, but as something entirely different. Rachel accepted the offer with caution. Trust was not immediate, could not be, but necessity created a starting point. Over the following days, Daniel focused on practical solutions. He worked with legal advisors to ensure Rachel had proper representation. He coordinated with social services to address housing and financial assistance. He used his resources to stabilize a situation that had previously been defined by instability. The process was deliberate. It avoided assumptions. It prioritized structure over sentiment. Rachel, in turn, began to regain control over her own narrative. The presence of her child within a secure environment allowed for decisions that had not been possible before. Each step forward was measured. Each decision carried weight. But the direction was clear. Daniel did not attempt to define what their relationship would become. That question did not require an immediate answer. What mattered was the present. A situation where harm had been addressed, and a path forward had been established. Meanwhile, the consequences for those responsible continued to unfold. Olivia's case moved through the legal system with increasing clarity. The evidence against her did not rely on interpretation. It was supported by documentation, testimony, and the structure of the plan itself. Her initial resistance gave way to a more subdued position as the reality of the situation became unavoidable. The future she had attempted to secure through deception no longer existed in any form she could control. Margaret faced a similar trajectory, though her role as the primary organizer carried additional weight. The system she had built to achieve a specific outcome had collapsed under scrutiny. Her influence, which had once been an asset, now functioned as evidence of intent. Sarah and the physician entered a different phase of accountability. Their cooperation influenced the legal approach, but it did not erase the consequences. Their professional identities were permanently altered. The decisions they had made, justified at the time as assistants, had resulted in violations that extended beyond personal judgment. Daniel did not maintain active involvement in their cases. He followed developments when necessary, but his focus remained elsewhere. The need to understand every detail of their outcomes diminished over time. What mattered had already been established. As weeks passed, a new routine began to form. It did not resemble the life Daniel had expected, but it carried a different kind of clarity. The absence of deception created space for something more stable, even if it required rebuilding from the ground up. Rachel transitioned into her own apartment with Daniel's support. The arrangement was structured to provide independence rather than dependency. Financial assistance was provided with clear boundaries. The goal was not to replace one form of control with another, but to create conditions where Rachel could sustain her own stability. The child, no longer defined by confusion or conflict, existed within a framework that recognized her identity without question. That clarity mattered more than any narrative that had been constructed before. Daniel remained present, but not as a replacement for anything that had been lost. His role was defined by choice, not by obligation or expectation. The connection that developed between him and Rachel's child was not based on ownership. It was based on responsibility, acknowledged without distortion. Over time, the intensity of the initial events began to recede. The legal process continued in the background. The consequences unfolded as expected, but the immediate crisis gave way to something more sustainable. Daniel's understanding of family changed. It was no longer tied to assumptions about structure or biology. It was no longer defined by what had been promised or expected. It became something grounded in action, in accountability, in the willingness to face reality without distortion. He did not attempt to recover the life he had lost. He built a different one, not defined by perfection but by honesty, not protected by illusion, but sustained by truth. And in that shift, Daniel recognized something he had not understood before, that the value of a life is not measured by how closely it matches what was imagined, but by the choices made when the truth becomes impossible to ignore. Thank you sincerely for taking the time to listen to today's story. Your attention means more than you may realize. Stories like this are not just about events or outcomes, they are about the choices people make when faced with difficult truths, and the consequences that follow those choices. In a world where it can be easy to look away, this story reminds us of the importance of honesty, responsibility, and compassion. One of the most important lessons we can take from this story is that the truth, no matter how painful, always deserves to be faced. Real strength is not found in avoiding reality, but in having the courage to confront it and act with integrity. It also reminds us that even in situations shaped by mistakes and wrongdoing, there is always an opportunity to make things right, to protect those who are vulnerable, and to choose what is fair over what is convenient. If this story made you reflect, feel something, or see things from a different perspective, we would truly appreciate your support. Supporting our channel is simple. Just press the like button, share your thoughts in the comments below, and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss future stories. Once again, thank you for being here and for being part of this journey.